I'm very convinced that in the Western tradition we've been working on a set of problems that to a great degree are our problems, and that the future work must be on problems that are from other cultural contexts in connection with other problems like a renewed sense of sustainability or the new technologies that are coming online and that we have to work with. So my talk today, although it's now called Exploring Translation Studies, Theories, is really about how we use translation and theorizing about translation to solve problems. And I'm asking myself, do we need, for example, an Asian set of theories or a Japanese theory or a Rico University theory or an Australian theory? Or do we need specific theories because there are different places? Or do we need new work to try to solve new problems? Where does equivalence come from? Well, the assumption that languages are equal, the age when orality has demised as the main means of transferring texts, and the printing press means we have a fixed press. All the mistakes I made here are printed here, and I can't change them. That's frustrating for authors, but actually, for the first time, when you have the printing press, you can be equivalent to something. Prior to the printing press, a translator had to go and establish the source text, that is, collect different manuscripts, compare the variations, and decide which was the source text that was going to be translated. The printing press says, there it is, and there you are. It's easy to see a relation one-to-one. Printing was very important, and the national vernaculars started their standardization process, which was also a direct consequence of the printing press. They had to learn how to spell. They had to decide how to spell. So equivalence really belongs to the age of equality between languages, that is nation-states, the printing press, and a standardization of languages. That's equivalence. That applied in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. It hasn't really been questioned enough until today. Why was European translation theory so enamored of equivalence in the late 20th century? Well, here you go. They needed laws that were going to operate in different languages and still have the same validity. If you do that, you need to assume equality between languages. You need to assume juridic equivalence, at least. They had to train mediators who could be legally trustworthy. And not say, I put this because it sounded nice. Or, I think it's more elegant this way. Or, I have developed the language in... No. You had to produce a certain invisibility in the mediator in order to assure the legal regime of equality. And at the same time, intellectuals were profoundly influenced by structuralism, which suggested that culture and the humanities could be analyzed scientifically. Those three things, probably more, came together and formed a regime, a common notion that translation was the production of equivalence. Translation theory only had to concern equivalence. In Europe, in those years, I'm talking about Vinet-Dabelnet and all the comparative linguists who worked at the period, through to Otto Kader, the Leipzig School, etc. Quite in parallel, but in a different, Eugene Nida is a missionary. He wants to get people to read the Bible in the jungles. It's a completely different problem. He says, how can I prove to you that the God speaks your language? And he goes out to the Eskimo, the Inuits, people up in the coal pot, and he says, the Lamb of God, Agnus Dei. And they say, I don't know what a lamb is. I've never seen a lamb. So he says, well, it's the seal of God, and a seal is as good as a lamb. Okay, and this is an example of cultural adaptation or dynamic equivalence. And he says, look, if they understand that the seal has the same function as a lamb, if they understand the message, that's good enough. I'm bringing God's word to them. Or Moses came down from the hilltop. And it was a hearty handshake all round. In the Bible, they kiss each other. But for some cultures, you can't have men kissing each other, so it's a handshake all round. Okay, they understand it. Cultural adaptation. And the native or Inuit exclaims, I didn't know God spoke my language. Well, he didn't, but Eugene Nida does. Okay. Evangelical equivalence, or what we do call dynamic equivalence, cultural adaptation, if you like, was developing in the same years as European multilingualism, using the same term, equivalence, but to solve an entirely different problem. The kind of equivalence that Eugene Nida wants people to use in the jungles for the Bible is not the same kind that people had to use in the European Commission. Completely different. But the same term was there, and they could read each other, understand and take from each other, and form a paradigm. A paradigm where people talk about translation using the same vocabulary with a basic understanding. The paradigm brought together those four things. And people were solving different problems, and often we didn't really understand because the jungles are not like Brussels yet. But the paradigm function. This book is based on paradigms, and I'm trying to present this so you get an idea of how paradigms work. It's a set of terms that enable us to talk about translation, to set up a conversation. It's not yet a solution. It's not yet the problem in itself, but it enables us to address a series of problems with a common language. And that is what has been happening throughout the history of translation theory. That's why this book is based on a series of chapters, each of which is focused on a different paradigm. To the extent that people in one paradigm will not understand people in the other paradigm. There will be serious misunderstanding when you cross from one to the other. And there sure is. There is lots of misunderstanding. Not just between theorists and practitioners, which is a huge misunderstanding both ways, but especially between theorists who are working on different problems in different contexts. Let me move to another example. You might be aware of the School of German Language Translation Theorists who come under this banner, Skopos theory. Skopos just means the aim or purpose of your translation. And the fundamental notion here is that when you translate, your work is determined, is governed, not by what's in the source text in the first place, but by what your client wants you to do, by what has to be achieved with the translation, by the purpose of the translation on the target side. I hope that's not new to you. I don't have a lot of time to explain the details. But this theory, really, there are early papers in the late 70s by Femer, to whom I pay homage. He died about a month ago now, and deserves sincere recognition for his courageous work in this paradigm. He's the main, Hans Femer was the main theorist behind this paradigm. Why did they insist that the source text is not the main determinant and that the target side purpose is? Why did Femer claim he had dethroned the source text. It's what a revolutionary does. You dethrone a king. Now, the king is no more. There's a new king out here. People in Japan change governments easily, I noticed. You know? The emperor is untouchable. Okay. Well, okay, so a minor revolution then. Why did he do that? And I think he's quite right to do that. I sign up for that, fine, that's okay. And he's not saying just be free and do whatever you want. The theory says achieve the purpose that is required. If the purpose is to be very literal and philological, then you do that. Okay, so he's sometimes misinterpreted as saying, be free, my children, go out and do whatever you want. No, he says, follow the purpose of the translation, which may be equivalence or not. This is from a book by Christiane Nord called Translation as a Purposeful Action, I think. And you can see where we are. There is communication. There are two kinds, intracultural, within a culture, and cross-cultural, or intercultural, if you like. Here there are two kinds. It can be mediated, with a person there who is an expert, or direct, as I am talking with most of you. Okay? What is translatorial action is what translators do. What do translators do? Well, it's mediated cross-cultural communication. That's where we are. But in this theory, translatorial action, the adjective translatorial refers to the translator, can be with a translation, translational, or not. This means translators can produce translations, but they can also tell the client, I'm sorry, but your source text is a load of rubbish. Or it's a good try, but it's not going to work in Japan because Japanese culture is very different. This is when you do some advice or consulting. I can see what you want to do. Will you allow me to write a new text based on this? Or can I take this text and reduce it, or take out the references to American culture and put in references to Japanese culture? Or can I engage in terminological work to help the project? Or marketing research, which might come in here in an advanced or extended form of advice. The idea here was that translators do more than translate. That's pretty good. People before they didn't say that. Why did they say that? Well, I wonder if that's going to tell me. Because at the time, they could see that from the translation faculties in Germany, their graduates were going out into the marketplace, being trained to translate in a very narrow, prescriptive equivalence way, and were finishing up getting jobs doing many other things, such as people working in marketing, such as terminology. Lots went into the software sector and finished up doing engineering on localization projects or desktop publishing or handling the graphics in general. And others were required to do terminological work. The market spoke through the graduate students to the teachers saying, well, wait a minute, you have to train them to do more than translate. The market demands, at least in that period in mid-1980s Germany, pierced the academic armor, erupted into a new theory, dethroned the previous paradigm, and got people to think radically about what kind of cross-cultural communication is really necessary in industry. And I think that was a good revolution. I think we need more of it at the moment when we have new technologies coming into the industry and are not getting into the teaching process, into the academy. However, this is where I start to say bad things about people, okay? So I'm going to go really fast. I don't know if you should cite me. Anyway, I don't care. The German faculties were very big. They still are. That means, 5,000 students. 3 to 5, some are smaller, 3 to 5,000 students. That's a lot of power. Those are good academic jobs, because full German professors, since Bismarck, are paid at the level of the haute bourgeoisie, the high, the rank below the aristocracy. Professor, you're like a general in the army if you're a professor in Germany. So you want your faculty to be your professor. You do not want your translation faculty to mix with a modern language faculty. I don't know if this is a touchy concern here. And they jealously guarded the distinction between learning a language or a literature and translation. They have separate buildings, separate professorships, separate publications, separate students, separate academic power. So to say, it looks really anodyne, translators do more than translate, is a market reality, but also a very efficient way of making sure you keep your jobs for your friends. Okay, academic politics dovetailed, met with the surge of market demands. 2 reasons come in to produce that change in thinking, and others which we could go into, but I don't think I have time. Okay? Change doesn't come, there's not just one problem. Solutions can address several problems at the same time. That is a very interesting fact of technological progress, conceptual progress in this term. My second attempt to say bad things. There is a theory out there associated with the term polysystems. Polysystems means that translation happens between this society and this society, and this one is a system of systems. It's a complex systemic structure, a polysystem, and so is this one. And I can see where the translation enters this system. Does it occupy a central role, in which case it brings about cultural change and becomes very important for the culture? Or does it occupy a peripheral role, in which case it acts in a conservative way and reinforces the patterns that are predominant in the culture? That was 3 sentences, polysystem theory. Now, why did people ask that question? The question was, what is the role of translation within society when we see society as a system? Is it conservative or revolutionary? Lots of case studies have been carried out over the years within what's called descriptive translation studies. Most of them have found, unfortunately, that translations tend to be peripheral and conservative and not bring about many revolutions. Tend to be, but there are significant exceptions. Let me just point out what's common knowledge. This way of thinking about translation developed in small countries. Israel, Belgium, Holland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic. Smaller societies, the smaller your language, the higher the percentage of translations in that language. Try it. Walk into a bookshop in Holland, and then a bookshop in London. In Holland, you will find, actually these days, you find things in German and English, and translation is an enormous part of what's available, next to the Dutch, or within the Dutch, okay? Whereas in English, translations are a minimal percentage, 2 to 4%. Holland, it might be 35%. France, the figures for France, or French, or Italian, or Spanish are around 25%. Anyway, The smaller the society, the bigger, the more central the role of translation. So it's logical that in societies that have an enormous presence of translations, you're going to ask about the poly system and what translations are doing. And it's logical that in a society like the United States, that has translations at 2 to 4%, nobody ever asked that question. It was not a problem. There are very, very few translation studies in the United States. I'll see what does exist in a minute, because the social problem was never there. It coincided, of course, with a structuralism again, the desire for science. And these people could refer back to the tradition of Russian formalism, but I'm not going to go into intellectual history. So they thought that way because they were in small societies. That's all I'm going to say. My third attempt to say bad things. You mentioned Lawrence Venuti, I think, and foreignization versus domestication. Venuti, as you know, in his book, The Translator's Invisibility, argues that translators should show the foreignness of the source text. They should not read in a fluent manner. The mediation of the translator should be visible. If I get up and read a translated text, it should not be like reading a text in normal American English. Foreignization had its reason in the German tradition, and Venuti refers back to that tradition. It had a reason with respect to French, and Berman referred to that. But when you get to the United States, and Lawrence Venuti in New York in the 1990s, it's not the same reason. You know, the foreignization that Schleiermacher needed to develop the German language, because the state and the glory would come later. You know, Adolf Hitler had a translation policy. It was the same as Schleiermacher's. We have to open the German language to foreign terminology for the same reason, to become a Weltsprache, a world language. Anyway, by the time you get to New York, it's not the same problem. And it's not the same problem as French, which has for centuries been closed to outside influence and reproducing, stagnating within its own traditional eloquence. The problem is that you have an intellectual elite operating in universities which wants to present itself as being both progressive and international. And so we can associate foreignization with a critique of the rest. The critique, as you know, if you've seen that book, says that Anglo-American cultures only translate 2 to 4% of their book production and are therefore hegemonic and are therefore closed to the outside and are therefore xenophobic in their international relations. Bad, bad, bad. And the only way to solve this is to translate in a foreignizing way, like we do, the progressive New York-based elite. It's a good argument. It's a good strategy. You're not happy with the culture you're in, you oppose a different one. But what's the problem with that? Well, you're arguing against domestication, right? You're arguing against adaptation. And you would say anybody who uses domestication is therefore imperialistic, hegemonic, closed to outside influence, bad, 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 and you know, CIA and George W. Bush and invading Iraq and the whole lot. And if we translate in this new way, you know, everything, oh no, that's stupid. I mention this because we had the honor of having Lawrence Venuti come to Barcelona and give a talk. And people, not me, but others raised their hand and said, look, here, working into Catalan, We are trying to develop our own language from within our own morphological resources. You know, the protection of our culture requires domestication. We don't like borrowing terms from the outside because we already have too many of them, from English and from Spanish in particular. And so here we have to use domestication, and we are not hegemonic and we are not imperialistic. Okay? And I know Venuti was sort of stopped in his tracks. Suddenly he could see a problem, a cultural problem that was entirely different from the problem he had been working on out of New York. And he couldn't pick up his solution from the United States and apply it to Catalan. The same in Brazil. I had a student in Brazil who wrote a paper, and she said, oh, Venuti finds all these things in American culture, and that's bad, and I can find them in Brazilian culture. So Brazilian culture must be really bad because we translate in a fluent, domesticating way. And I said, well, wait a minute. If you're imperialistic, with respect to whom? And who are you invading? And I can see a rich, vibrant, multicultural, certainly monolingual, multicultural society, very open, language learning is very good. Something's wrong with the theory, or something's wrong with Brazil. Well, if you look closer, in fact, Brazil has long had domestication as a policy and a general norm, because its main historical problem has not been invading Iraq, it's been literacy. It's been that people learned to read through accessible translations. A great deal of adventure literature, literature for children, foreign literature in general, is made accessible so literacy rates will increase. And that has been the problem of that country. Nothing to do with Venuti's critique of the United States. Different situation, different problem. You cannot pick up the solution from one place and apply it in another. The application of corpus linguistics was announced by people like Sarah Laviosa as being a revolution within translation studies, because it brought in new tools with which to study translation and a relatively, well, apparently new set of questions. One of the innovations that corpus studies brought to translation was the possibility of looking at a corpus, that is just a big electronic collection of texts that are translations in English. And then looking at the British National Corpus, and there are other corpora, which is a whole big mess of texts that are non-translations. And you compare the translations statistically against the non-translations. And you find that statistically there are differences. That translators tend to use a kind of language that non-translators don't use. And it's interesting. That's interesting, isn't it? If you're a translator, you say, hey, wait a minute. How can that be so? Why is that so? One of the examples in English is connector that. Okay? The girl that I saw. Okay? The girl that I saw is correct in English, but I can also say the girl I saw. Oh, it's reporting that. I said that. Anyway, it's the same thing. Don't worry about it. In English, you can put it in or leave it out, right? No difference. Guess what translators do? Do they put it in more or leave it out more? Well, they put it in. Okay? There's a very significant difference that if you do a search for that, it's actually the study is on reporting that. She said that. Translators put it in and non-translators leave it out. Translators are therefore more explicit, they explain more, they normalize more. There are a whole series of hypotheses like that. I find that interesting. But was that a problem? Were we really worried that translators use connector that more than non-translators? At the time, this was in the early 1990s, I gave my own translations to be part of that corpus, because I translate into English. And Mona Baker and Maeve Olahan told me what they'd found. And from that moment onwards, as a translator, you know what I do? I leave out the optional that. So the theory is not going to work on me anymore. Okay. Why did that methodology appear at that time and place? That's my question. Was it because connected that was a huge social issue in Britain in the 1990s? No, sir, it was not, I posit. Consider this. One of the main industries in the United Kingdom is international students who go there to improve their English. It's big business. They pay big university fees too. Because of that, applied linguistics, especially of English, is a very big, profitable academic discipline. So most English theorists working on translation are applied linguists. Ian Mason, Basil Hatim, you might know their books. They are doing text linguistics. Mona Baker's first book, in other words, is basically text linguistics applied to translation. And the use of comparative corpora, of getting the translations in English and comparing them with the non-translations in English, means that you can go to England and Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales and study translation entirely in English. Everybody can do it. You can go there and be next to people from France and Germany and South Africa and Malaysia, and you're all there, you're all speaking English, and you're all studying translations in English, and you're talking English, and you will improve your English. Sometimes these master's programs are supposed to train you to be a translator without any other language. Now, for me, that makes perfect economic sense because you get students to pay big fees. And it makes disastrous cultural sense because translation, I'm sorry, requires at least 2 languages and at least the problematic encounter between at least 2 cultures. If not, all our concern with alterity, foreignness, negotiation, the encounter with the other, has disappeared into what Michael Cronin here should call monolingual imagination or mindless bliss. That I finished with corpus linguistics. Cultural translation has been mentioned, and for me, cultural translation is incredibly interesting as a paradigm. I don't associate it with the cultural turn of the early 1990s, where people said, well, in addition to the linguistic factors, we have to look at the cultural factors in the act of translation. That was one thing, and very valid. But for me, that was in the descriptive paradigm and had been done well before that by the people in Prague, certainly, in Bratislava, in Leipzig, and then in Israel. It was not new, I'm sorry. Cultural translation, though, in the sense I want to refer to here, is a product of the 1990s, the late 1990s, and it refers to translation as a problematic and a process in which there are no translations. Translation without translations. How is that so, you ask? Well, as was pointed out, the first usage of the term cultural translation was by British ethnographers who go out to a supposedly primitive, distant society and write it up, describe it in English. And so they have to find descriptions in English for a social reality, a cultural reality that is not in English. And they started to think about their production of descriptions as cultural translations. They were translating a culture, not a source text, a whole culture. And that's what ethnographers do. That's an interesting usage of the term. That has been extended to refer to the entire problematic of descriptions and self-descriptions across cultures, to the extent that the position of immigrants within a host culture is a problematic of translation. The communication that operates now, not between, for example, India and Britain as two languages or two cultures, taking immigrants from here and sending them there, calling those a translation. The problem is now based around the problematic third space in the terms of Homi Bhabha, which is that of the Indian Pakistani immigrants within Britain and the British colonial presence, post-colonial presence within India, where there is no pure culture here and no pure culture here. The translational problematic operates within a shared and overlapping third space. Trying to analyze the communication produced within and across that third space is a problem that people want to deal with through the term translation, used as a willful metaphor. It's translation as a process without actual translations. Why should they do that? Why did they take our word? I mean, I was quite happy talking about people who produce translations. I'm very happy trying to train translators. In Europe, I'm pretty happy trying to participate in the formation of translation policy. Why did those theorists, the post-colonial theorists, the cultural theorists in general, why did they steal my word? Your word, our word? Well, they had good reason. I think there are good reasons. There's a whole new set of problems there that we haven't really dealt with when we think about cultures, or that we deal with when we think about translations. If we're still analyzing translations in terms of source and target, this side and that side, we are not seeing the reality of the people we're working for. Who are they? Immigrants, they're already here. They're not there. Multinational companies, they're already here. They're not there. Export, well, we've got to work alongside people there and people here. Localization, we have to form teams, drawing people from there, from there, from there, from that expert field. I'll slow down in a minute. Translation is operating in a whole series of cultural and professional third spaces that are quite different from the binary oppositions that we once had. That's being recognized. And the metaphor translation enables people to think about communication without assuming any correct ideal understanding. Communication in which there is always shifting, always transformation. And it's a useful metaphor for people in cultural studies dealing with those problems. And once they got it in, and they got it in the late 1990s, they extended. So all interpreting is translation. All immigration, indeed all travel is translation. Our cultural heritage, the culture of the past communicating with the present, is also translation. Governments in fragmented postmodern societies has to be through translation, and there is a very long and so on. It's everywhere, ladies and gentlemen, and none of it concerns translation. I finished saying bad things. Cultural translation has nothing to do with translations. That's important to point out, but it's a very interesting area of inquiry, and I'm rather attracted to it. but not as a translation theorist, perhaps more as a sociologist or somebody who's concerned about our cultures. If you're interested in translations and only translations, they're good texts to read, but I don't think they're going to help you be a better translator necessarily. Different problems, same solutions. I said you cannot pick up a solution from one place and expect it to work in another. And yet, consider this. Cicero had an opposition. Eugene Nida had another one. Gideon Toury in the descriptive paradigm was saying much the same thing. Gilles Lévy, in early descriptivism, said translations can pretend to be original text, they're illusory, or not, anti-illusory. Juliana Haus was saying the same thing. Christiane Nort was saying the same thing. Lawrence Venuti was saying a similar thing. I think that's all. Now, each one of those oppositions is trying to solve a different problem. And yet I can line them up and they form a tradition. Because each person, when trying to solve the problem, will inevitably look around to see what has been done before on similar problems. Will inevitably pick up what's been done and try to make it work, and probably find it doesn't work. If you've got a problem here in Japan with translation or interpreting, you could pick up the whole lot of Western translation theory, and there's a lot more than is in here, and I hope it doesn't work. Because then you'll be forced to adapt and change it, to produce little changes, new terms, new insight, a different perspective. For all the problems that you have to encounter, and I can't tell you what your problems are, you'll know them. You'll know them through your professional practice. It's a simple message. You try the solutions from the past or from other cultures or from other theorists. You try it. From other disciplines especially, you're going to have to do that. Adapt them to what you find. See what works. And if it doesn't work, you go back to the drawing board.